Okay, folks, so this is the Job Pod revision recording for inquiry question 3 of the Migration, Identity and Sovereignty unit. So let's go first of all to the pupil learning checklist, which is linked to the spec. Here you can see inquiry question 3, the question itself. What are the impacts of global organizations on managing global issues and conflicts? So as from our previous recordings, I'm not going to focus down onto these particular bits because that's the individual lesson areas, but let's just give a summary of the overriding 3 themes within that question. So this one here, 8B.7, is global organizations are not new, but have been important in the post-1945 world. So this is from the end of the Second World War onwards. The second part of EQ3 is looking at intergovernmental organizations, IGOs, established after the Second World War, have controlled the results of world trade and financial flows. And then finally, the third part of EQ3, again, is intergovernmental organizations, IGOs, have been formed to manage environmental problems facing the world with varying success. So let's delve into the individual lessons that we have taught you, to just give you a run through. Now, again, this is not a standalone revision resource. This is just a run through of the EQ3 lessons, topic, content, case study examples. Not reteaching anything here. This is just a summary. So we started EQ3 with lesson 15, which was focusing on the United Nations. Now, the good thing with this is another synoptic link here back to the globalization unit itself. So let's quickly run through what we did here. So the main question there you can see for EQ3 is in red: what are the impacts of global organizations on managing global issues and conflicts? So this is where we delved into the United Nations. 2 elements here: explain the role and history of the United Nations and identify United Nations sub-organizations and their role in world peace. So this is where we began. We introduced the key term of what is an IGO, an intergovernmental organization. Again, I'm not going to read it to you because you can read it here and you've already got it in your notes. You must be clear on the definition of an intergovernmental organization. Then we broke this down into some basic ideas of IGOs, regarding what they actually do. So the role of peacekeeping around the world as a result of World War II, to try and ensure that another world war did not happen, to create peace, to create cooperation. And also the role of IGOs such as the United Nations in global governments, to set up agreements, to set up policies, rules, regulations, and so on. And also the United Nations to establish conventions. And there's many sub-organizations and branches of the UN, such as the UNDHR, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the Millennium Development Goals. So what we then looked at, again, this was a summary because we'd already looked at this briefly in the globalization unit, is what is the United Nations? Now, just bear with me 30 seconds. Sorry, folks, just got to plug my laptop in because it's decided it's going to run out of battery. Right, let's continue. So what is it? We went through what is the UN, what is the structure of the United Nations, what does it do? And there's some examples of subgroups there of the UN that we looked at. We looked at what are UN resolutions, what is the UN Security Council, and as part of that Security Council, what is this veto? So remind yourselves from your notes from the lesson on that and just pause here. We then looked at the UN foundations and what is the actual role of the United Nations as an IGO. So the bit on the left there, we would have discussed about its after the Second World War, when it was set up, how many nations. And then on the right-hand side, these 5 key areas, which is the role of the UN in maintaining international peace and security, promoting sustainable development, human rights, upholding international law, and then delivering humanitarian aid. They're the 5 key areas of the United Nations as an IGO. So pause to remind yourself here. You then created a timeline of the United Nations history from when it started after the Second World War right up to the 2000s, if you like, a timeline showing how the UN has evolved over time. And that would have been your final task for that lesson. It took you 20 minutes to 30 minutes. And then you researched and read about UNICEF, UNESCO, and the UNHCR. And you delved into each of those in terms of what's the aims and the core work, where it focuses its efforts in the world, so some examples, and then some examples of successful work. So that was the first lesson of EQ3, looking at the overriding United Nations as an IGO. That led on to lesson 16, which was focusing on United Nations sanctions. Now, we mentioned sanctions in that first UN lesson there. So we did a bit of recap, talked about the United Nations, a bit of the history again. And then we delved into the Security Council. And looking at the Security Council permanent members, which are the USA, China, UK, France, and Russia. We had a bit of a debate there on Russia. And then a bit of background on that Security Council, and related this in particular to what's happening currently and recently with Ukraine and Russia. So that was intro. The 2 main focus areas for this lesson was what are UN sanctions and interventions, and why might the UN intervene in a particular situation, conflict, dispute in the world. So we looked at types of sanctions, and first of all, you need to remind yourself of what a UN sanction is. And as you can read there, you can pause it, remind yourselves of what a sanction is. A bit more detail we went through on what a sanction is there on the screen. So pause and focus in particular on economic sanctions, and then also the direct military intervention as well. We then had a look at sanctions versus interventions and what is the difference between. So we focused down then on what is an economic sanction, what is a military intervention, and what is what we call unilateral action. So make sure you're clear on the difference between those 3. And then we delved into the possible sanctions that the UN can impose. And they usually fall under these 5 different bold terms here. We call arms embargoes, trade embargoes, restrictions on loans, the freezing of assets, and finally, travel restrictions. So remind yourselves of those different types of sanctions that are used by the United Nations. And I would then ask you at the end of that lesson, or halfway through the lesson, which do you think is most commonly used? And the most common one is the trade embargoes, restricting trade as much as possible on a particular country, a particular government, to get them to change their ways. And then was a big task for you to complete, was an evaluation of 4 particular UN sanctions. And you had a big A3 sheet with lots of resources to use. And you were looking at the UN sanctions against Iran, the UN intervention in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You were looking at the unilateral EU-USA sanction against Russia. And then if you had time, was the unilateral Turkey, France, USA interventions in Syria. Just bear with me whilst my Google Meet tries to kick me out. Okay, and with each of those 4 key areas, What was the reason for it? Why was it put into place? So, and a description of what was done. And the key bit to the evaluation, any evaluation, this could lead into a nice 20-mark evaluation question, the successes and failures of each of those types of interventions and sanctions. You had I'm not going to go through the resources because you had these at the time. You completed your evaluation on that. If you want to access those resources, go onto the sixth form learning platform. Okay, so that rounded off the second lesson of EQ3, which led very nicely on to lesson 17, looking at intergovernmental organisations. Again, following the same theme. And in particular here, looking at intergovernmental organisations, IGOs and SAPs, structural adjustment programs. Now, again, really good synoptic link here to the globalisation unit. 3 areas. What are the different types of IGO? What are the roles of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization? Which are the main economic IGOs? And then looking at an example where structural adjustment programs through the IMF World Bank were implemented upon Jamaica. So we started with a general discussion, a reminder really from the globalization unit of the World Bank, the World Trade Organization and the IMF. And then a brief summary of the role of each of these IGOs. In other words, what's the difference between the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO? So make sure you revise those differences. And then overall, recap again back to the last couple of lessons. What is the role of the overriding United Nations as a big IGO? And bringing back to the globalization unit again, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO are part of that collective group of IGOs which were developed and basically created as part of the Bretton Woods institutions. We went through another reminder, recap here of the Bretton Woods institutions, what it is, what does it actually mean as part of the Washington Consensus after the Second World War. And we went through some of the key principles that were agreed through the formation of those, of the World Bank, of the IMF, for example. We then looked at the structural adjustment plans or structural adjustment programs, SAPs. Now, these were used by the IMF if a country's defaulted on their debt, and we recapped what they were. But then looked at some of the critiques of these structural adjustment programs, some of the problems associated with the SAPs that were run through the IMF. And that then led into a case study looking at Jamaica, a country that had huge debts, were put under the structural adjustment program restrictions, and what happened in Jamaica. You completed that case study. You had all of these resources as part of that. So you should have all of these, but pause if you need a reminder. And then that led into some reading, a bit more depth on the multilateral debt trap in Jamaica, and a Guardian article on Jamaica's decades of debt and how it damaged its future. Okay, so progress onwards in EQ3. Lesson 18 is called Why Join Intergovernmental Organisations? What's the whole point in nation states joining these? 2 particular jobs here. What are the types of trade blocs and unions that can be joined? So trade blocs can be seen as IGOs. And how does joining IGOs impact upon the sovereignty of a nation? So this is where we started with looking at World Trade Organization membership and applications, where the green countries are members, the yellows were the one that currently applying, and the grey are not members of the WTO. We then discussed an overview of global and regional trade as part of IGOs. And then that bit in red, NAFTA and the EU are mentioned as regional trade blocs, and we discussed, can you think of any other trade blocks that you'd previously studied from the globalization unit? Again, another really good synoptic link. We reminded ourselves of the main trade blocks in the world: European Union, NAFTA, which is now changed, just to mention a couple of the other ones that you'd have looked at in globalization, ASEAN, the Free Trade Area Agreement within Asia, the Union of South American Nations, the Central American Integration System. These are all trade blocks as part of IGOs as well. And then we delved into the types of the trade blocks that are out there. And now, again, I'm not going to read through all of this. We did this in the lesson itself, so you've got all the notes. But make sure you're clear on the difference between a free trade area, a customs union, a single market, and a political union. And then we focused in particular on a political union as part of a trade bloc. What is a political union? We referred to centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. Remind yourselves of those. And then we focused a little case study example, if you like, of the UK leaving the IGO, the trade bloc of the EU, through the Brexit process. What were the arguments in favour? What were the arguments against? And that led into the final part, linking to sovereignty. The main two arguments which were used, the first one was for the Leave campaign, was that the British Parliament no longer had full sovereignty of the United Kingdom. And then the argument for the stayers, the remainers, was in a globalised world, every country must work closer together. And that led very nicely into the final lesson of EQ3, which is focusing in particular on environmental issues of the world and looking at the intergovernmental organisations focused particularly on the environment. So two jobs here: how successful have intergovernmental organisations been at managing environmental issues? And you did a very in-depth evaluation of the success and failures of particular IGOs as part of the United Nations. And then what laws have IGOs been responsible for in developing environmental protections? And this is where you did a big job. You've got all the notes on this and the detail. You focused down on 4 intergovernmental organisations as part of the United Nations: the Montreal Protocol from 1987, the Paris Agreement of 2015, CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora from 1975, and then UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, you've had loads of resources to use. Montreal Protocol, particularly looking at the ozone layer and what was done. Again, you had some detail on that to use as part of your analysis. How effective are IGOs at managing the environment? That was your particular job here, critically evaluating those 4 IGOs. And this is what you completed. Your 4 IGOs down the side, environmental IGOs. You then researched and create detailed notes on what was the aims and when were they established. And then your evaluation. What were the good things, the successes? And then what were some of the failures and some of the criticisms? Really good for a potential 20-mark evaluate question. And there's an example at the top right there. Evaluate the effectiveness of IGOs in protecting the environment from degradation and ultimate decline. So that was the final part of EQ3. If we return back to the checklist, so where do we begin? There is your overall EQ3 question. The lessons, as you now will see, focused on, in particular, first of all, global organisations are not new, but have been important in the post-1945 world. You will see now that some of those lessons were focused on IGOs established after the Second World War have controlled the results of world trade and financial. And then the final part of EQ3 was the environmental problems and how IGOs have been formed to manage and deal with those environmental problems. So, folks, that rounds off the summary of EQ3 for migration, identity, and sovereignty.